I'll open up the meeting for the City Council.
And I'll open up the meeting for the LTD Board.
And you have to do a roll call.
I have to do a roll call. Mr. Nicker?
I'm here.
Ms. Grossman is not able to be here. Ms. Pierce?
Here.
Mr. Gillespie?
Here.
Mr. Ye?
Here.
Ms. Den Time? I'm here, and Don Norden is not here.
So first thing I'd like to do is welcome you all, to tell you how nice it is to have you here for a joint meeting. Really appreciate the opportunity to do that. And then I'm going to turn it over to...
Okay, thanks very much. So this item this evening is a work session on the topic of moving ahead, which is a collaborative effort between the respective staff of Lane Transit District and City of Eugene Public Works, and they will make the presentation this evening. So we'll begin by just introducing Terry Harding to lead this off.
Thank you. So I'm Terry Harding with the Eugene Planning and Development Department, and I'm co-project managing this project with Sasha Leftig from Lane Transit and Chris Henry from the city's Public Works Department. So this is an opportunity to update you on what we've been doing since we last gathered at this table in May. So we'll tell you a little bit about what we've been doing, where we're headed, and prepare you for the action that we're asking you to take, each respective body, later in October. This phase of your decision making is about which corridors advance for further study under moving ahead. More detailed level design input and analysis will happen after this phase in level 2 of the project, and we'll explain more about that. So we were back with you in May. May 11th was the date. This is our second opportunity to get together. And this slide shows you the major steps of our level 1 screening process. From project kickoff until now, we held a series of community workshops in advance of developing the corridor concepts. So they're sort of off the slide. But the first green box there was the development of corridor concepts for each of the level 1 corridors that Sasha will go over with in a moment. Then we entered a phase of applying screening criteria, which Sasha will also describe in more detail. We took the concepts and the results of the screening out to the public, and Chris will go over that, results of the public input. And then Chris will also walk you through the recommendation that the Oversight Committee has made to you and that is in your packet, and talk to you about the decision that we're asking you to make in October and the next steps that will come in level 2 of the project. Remind you of the land use planning context for this project. Our region is planning to grow more compactly in centers and along corridors as our primary way of managing population and job growth. In Eugene, redevelopment strategies for housing, commercial services, and employment all depend on efficient build-out of our regional bus rapid transit system. To meet all of 7 pillars of Envision Eugene, including compact development and efficient transportation, climate and energy resilience, and neighborhood livability, the transit improvements must be planned in collaboration with biking and walking improvements. In addition, planning for effective transportation investments requires using this land use vision as a context for where people are traveling to and through in our community. A well-planned transportation system provides safe and accessible transportation for everyone while supporting our other goals, including great neighborhoods, healthy people, and a healthy economy. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about our level 1 corridors, and I'll hand it off to Sasha.
Thanks, Terry. So just to remind you of which corridors we're looking at for level 1, there's a map here that shows Highway 99, River Road, Coburg Road, Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, 30th Avenue to Lane Community College, and Valley River Center. Just as a reminder, Beltline was not looked at as an individual corridor, but as an important connector service to provide a crosstown connection without requiring a downtown transfer. And also, one additional update on this list. Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard used to include Centennial Boulevard, but after conversations with the city of Springfield, they really want to focus their resources and time currently on the Main Street McVeigh Transit Study, so they asked us not to look at capital investments in the Centennial portion at this time. That doesn't preclude Centennial benefiting from any increased frequency in transit service that might come out of this process. So, and as a reminder, what we're talking about in terms of the different types of transit investments, we're looking at a range of from fixed route, our traditional fixed route service, all the way to comprehensive MX, and what is appropriate at this time in the next 5 to 10 years in terms of investments. That range in the middle falls what's called enhanced corridors. And we're thinking about that in two ways, both the capital investment in infrastructure and then the investment in increased frequent transit service. So on the capital investment side, that means things such as queue jumps that I talked about at our last meeting and transit signal priority. Also, better amenities, improvements in rider amenities. And then on the frequency side, that might mean investing in frequency of 15-minute service or better. And so that is the range of ideas in terms of transit concepts that we've talked about with the public at the public workshops, and that is what helped inform the conversation that led to the corridor concepts. So based on the input we heard from those community workshops, online feedback, and technical expertise, we created concepts for each corridor. These concepts are attachment A in your packets, and all of these concepts, with the exclusion of Valley River Center, include options for MX and enhanced corridors, as well as a no-build option. Valley River Center, after feedback at the workshops and looking at what is projected in terms of needs in the next 5 to 10 years, it was determined at this point in time MX investments are not a priority for that corridor, so we only looked at enhanced corridor option for that corridor. These concepts, all 14 of them, were brought to the community in August and we've been gathering input that Chris is going to go over in a moment. They represent really a high-level idea of what type of transit investment could take place along these corridors. And as we determine which corridors advance into level 2, that will be where we refine those ideas and perhaps combine different elements of the different corridor concepts. I also want to take a moment to mention that in addition to the moving ahead corridors we're really looking at how to integrate this with our regular transit service and our network of transit service. So the map here is just an example of very initial thinking about how the corridor could conceptually integrate with other transit service. And this means looking at our long-term needs, our midterm needs, increasing east and west connectivity in our region, and increasing frequency. It includes things like thinking about what type of transit service we'll need to support the 2021 track and field championships, potential airport service in the long term, increasing service frequency on other routes, and how neighborhood service would tie into these corridors we're studying now. So this project really isn't taking place in a vacuum. We're doing the necessary planning now because this project will lead to implications for the whole region and what transit service we provide. Now the juicy piece, the corridor screening results. So this is attachment B in your packet. As well, you received a later memo summarizing the level 1 screening results. Again, all of these corridors were evaluated against a no-build option. A couple assumptions made for the level 1 concepts include that all routes terminate at Eugene Station, and the concepts will not include new river crossings or modifications to existing bridges. The assumption that all routes terminate at Eugene Station is made so we can really compare apples to apples, which is important for this level 1, very high level screening. The criteria we looked at includes connectivity and travel time, improvements in safety, estimated cost and funding opportunities, 2035 ridership projections, and then several criteria under community, including consistency with community vision. So we really are at this level, at the 100-foot level in terms of detail in this project. So as we move into level 2, that's where we really dive into the weeds. And if you look at this table, it is really difficult to discern how one corridor is substantially better than another. And you're going to see that statement reflected in the recommendation that Chris is going to now walk through, as well as the public outreach.
Thank you, Sasha. Moving ahead is reimagining our streets and places, creating options for people that walk, ride a bicycle, roll with a mobility device, or take the bus. In that effort, this project team has participated in over 20 events over the summer, community events, to engage and hear from people how their needs could be best served by those improvements for walking, biking, and transit. We received nearly 400 responses to an online and in-person survey, and we've had a few sounding board meetings where we've heard from a rather broad representation of representatives from other appointed committees from the city and the Lane Transit District. Over 40 people attended a public open house on September 14th to review the results of this level 1 screening as well. These next two slides are results of the survey and percentages to show whether people are interested in considering MX service or enhanced bus service on an enhanced corridor on the 6 corridors under consideration. And the takeaway from these two slides is that there isn't a negative sentiment in the community that we should not continue to study these corridors. That what is similar about them is that we should continue looking at bus rapid transit or MX service along with enhanced corridor for all 6 of the corridors. We also heard from people that they wanted to improve crossings east-west through the community and connections throughout the system. That touches on how Beltline the Randy Pape Beltline might serve the community, and the system improvements and regular bus service that Sasha talked about earlier. There's an interest, of course, in safety for all people that use the transportation system, and a continued concern about supporting businesses being sensitive to their needs throughout the process. As a reminder about the decision-making process, we continue to hear from the public throughout the process. We hear from our engaged representatives from the sounding board and the project management team. Tonight, you received a recommendation that's coming from the project management team that was also supported by the sounding board, although not necessary. They chose to make a recommendation. And then the project oversight committee also made a recommendation to you, the decision-making body of the City Council and Lane Transit District Board. The Oversight Committee has recommended to advance for further study both MX service and an enhanced corridor on River Road, Coburg Road, Highway 99, and 30th Avenue out to Lane Community College, and then just to consider enhanced corridor service on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. For future study in a program of improvements, what's not studied now will continue to be studied throughout the program would be the Randy Pape Beltline and service out to Valley River Center, as well as connections to Centennial Boulevard in Springfield. What you'll be asked to be doing is taking action on this recommendation. The Eugene City Council first on October 12th, and the Lane Transit District Board of Directors next on October 21st. The process going ahead after you've made your decision has a few steps. With the level 2 alternatives analysis, we will refine corridor concepts that were initially developed in level 1. We will conduct an impact analysis as part of the National Environmental Policy Act. We will continue to gather public input and share with them what we're learning throughout the process, with a focus on the individual corridors rather than looking at the system as a whole. We'll still be looking at the system, but we're going to be engaging more deeply along each of the corridors to identify concerns and opportunities. And then ultimately there will be a selection of a locally preferred alternative that goes into even more detailed analysis in the National Environmental Policy Act. We'll check in with you again probably late in January, and then if all goes well, perhaps in April or thereabouts. look forward to your questions and discussion.
Thank you very much. So when you, the advance for further study, is it still out there where you're thinking that you might end up pursuing all of the above, or?
Yes, we're saying consider both MX service and enhanced corridor service on 4 corridors, and then enhanced corridor service on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard.
And the only other thing I was going to say is, did you feel like your, I know I read what you said and heard what you said about your outreach. Do you feel like you've heard enough from the different parts of the community about these ideas?
And it's reflected in the survey responses as well. People aren't telling us, don't do this. There has been interest in each of the corridors and very well-attended community workshops throughout the process this summer.
I would add a little bit to that, too. Aside from the community events that we attended, we've been continuing to reach out to groups that are interested and want to hear about this project, and that includes the Chamber of Commerce,
Leaders.
Lions and Club in Bethel. A variety of different groups have asked to hear about the project and have helped us reach more people that are connected to those networks.
So in the ones that you're looking at, maybe that's in the next stage, or maybe you've already done it, are you already connecting with the neighborhood associations in those areas?
We've been to several neighborhood association meetings and other community groups, as Terry mentioned.
So, Gary, I'm going to let you help me with this. So I think I saw Mike, and I think I saw George, and,
You know, you got Gary.
okay, you got Gary. Okay, we'll just switch back and forth. Anybody? Okay, Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. I wonder during the course of, and thank you, by the way, for the report. It's a lot of work that we're talking about here, and it's very long-term planning that's very good. And it's good for us to take an inclusive approach of asking the community about their thoughts on this on a step-by-step and conservative basis. But I wonder, I haven't seen as much as I probably should have at this point about your community outreach and the kinds of presentations that you're making when you're asking people about preferences. So I appreciate very much the survey information about people's preferences, but I wonder, do you talk about the costs and restrictions likely involved in some of these corridors, or the challenges in getting that done as a part of that presentation?
Yes, actually at the community workshops in May, we had this very hands-on approach to public engagement, and it was where we actually had them first brainstorm needs and opportunities along the corridor that we were focused on at that workshop, talking about key areas where maybe there's a difficult crossing section. Then the second activity during those workshops was really playing with pieces that can fit in the right-of-way, and we had diagrammed for the specific corridor what the width of that right-of-way was. So they understood and were playing with everything they wanted to see in the corridor and the constraints, and understanding what fits and what might not fit.
Specifically to your question, it was more of a visioning process about how the available space or wider could be used, but cost at that point was not a constraint in that discussion.
The reason I ask is because I know George here is the expert on council in terms of the person with the most experience on the Coburg Road area with regard to transit and the studies that have been done there and the cost over time. And I know that we have some bottleneck constraints with regard to some of the buildings being built right up to curb front, or to the property line there, and forcing an in-lane travel. I wonder, my understanding is that Willamette gets about 16,000 cars a day, something like that.
Yes, that's accurate.
And Coburg is?
The lower end about 45,000,
Right.
and the upper end close to 30,000.
That was my understanding too. So it's about 3 times as many folks trying to get up and down Coburg as try and travel Willamette. And so from my perspective, I would have a difficult time with the idea that we would ever put something in lane and decrease the number of travel lanes available to automobiles on Coburg Road. That would be, I think that would cause I know at least in my ward, that would cause a good deal of concern. So I'll look forward as we go to seeing more of how it's studied and what's put forward. But I would agree to move forward with the caveat that I would almost be ready to remove Coburg Road as an option for MX, just from the standpoint that I am undereducated about how that could possibly work in that circumstance.
Treatments might not be uniform throughout the corridor. We would certainly look for ways to bypass points of congestion, and we'll definitely have to be sharpening our pencil as we look more closely at the footprint of those improvements.
On the other hand, I'm sorry, I cut you off, Sasha. Please go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, if you look at the Coburg Road MX option, it does not look at repurposing a lane. It maintains the travel lanes. It does look at creating, our consultants believe, this is from a very high-level perspective, but that there's enough right-of-way existing to squeeze one lane in that would allow transit to bypass some congestion.
In part.
Yeah, in the congested part, I believe you're imagining
Okay.
in your head, which
Well,
would be 105 to Harlem.
Right. Well, I know sometimes today, I live up in the north part of Eugene, and sometimes it can take a half an hour to get from Ferry Street Bridge to Costco. And, that's not that long a distance to take that long, but if you're catching it at the wrong time, you're in real trouble. The other piece that I was wondering about or that I'd like to comment on is to say that, on the other hand, I'm very much in favor of the idea of River Road and 99 as potential MX corridors. As time goes on and as those studies develop, I'll be really interested to see that. I think that makes a lot of sense to me, as does the 30th to LCC. Thank you.
So I mean this in the most courteous
Please
way.
do, Mayor.
Everybody. I was trying without the timer, but we're going to use the 3-minute timer just to move us around. So just letting you know that.
Mr. Gillespie?
Yeah, I was in, I believe, 3 of the 5 workshops, and I'm on the oversight committee. And even in the workshops, there were routes mentioned that weren't part of the workshop. I think every workshop I went to, someone said fix Coburg Road. And part of the consideration, too, was not only just getting up and down Coburg Road, but getting across it as a pedestrian. That can lead to some excitement, too. And so I think there was quite a bit of response on that. And in terms of the hands-on materials, especially on Highway 99, as it was said, you got a layout of the right-of-way. And pretty much to a person, people stayed within the right-of-way. There wasn't saying, let's take out this sidewalk, or let's take out this Applebee's or whatever. People stayed within that right-of-way. And even on River Road, much like you said, Coburg Road has 2 sets of traffic numbers. On River Road, the discussion was from the terminus down to Beltline, and then from Beltline down. So there was even discussion of dividing it there. But it was a very robust discussion, and we got lots of good input, I think, from people, particularly along the line of attaching bike ped transportation to the existing bus service or whatever service was there. And I got a minute and
You don't have to use it to
I yield to Mr. Clark for the next time he runs over.
That'll teach you not to give me a timer, won't it?
Thank you. First of all, I too want to thank you for all the public outreach that's done ahead of this and as we're traveling through this. Chris, you sent out an email with a memo, and on the back page it has the table 1. It's got the listed corridors. Is that in any particular order of priority, or is that just the way it came out, or?
It's not out.
Down at the very bottom.
That's geographically oriented from west to east and south.
Okay.
It's no priority.
Right. And then of the 370 plus online surveys, I'm just kind of curious, was there any way to tell particularly the questions or answers given in reference to the River Road route, is there any way to distinguish between residents of the city and non-residents of the city that live in the River Road, Santa Clara area that may have responded to this?
No, we didn't ask that kind of demographic information.
Okay. All right. And then kind of in reference to what Mike was saying about the Coburg Road corridor, in 2002, September, when I first was put on the stakeholders group, we did an 18-month study. And part of the problem with us coming up with a decision was that at the time, the city council, which I was not on yet, made the determination that the Coburg corridor was 80% dedicated lane usage. And after 18 months, it was determined that it wouldn't happen that way, and that's why it didn't move forward. But since then, they've come up with all these new ideas and techniques like the queue jumping and the bat lanes and everything else. So, I'm good with going ahead and continuing a study of the Coburg Road corridor, especially the north end, where there's a lot of development going on now. I don't know, Ron, you live up in that area. You see all the housing projects and all the apartments and everything going on, and with the VA hospital and everything else. So I'm good with continuing on with studying that. I just hope we don't spend a lot of time studying the stuff that we did in 2002 and 2003. And again, I'm going to emphasize it's very important, and you've done a good job to this point, but it's very important to stay out in front with the contacts in the community in all of these corridors so you don't have a lot of surprised citizens. Granted, there's going to be people that aren't going to be aware of what's going to happen until the day it actually starts, but the more that the word gets out ahead of time, the better, I think, and the easier the process will flow.
Well,
Go ahead.
I only wanted to speak to Mike's question. The moving ahead workshops were at a breakdown table level. It wasn't a panel and an audience. It was at a table where you were with 5 or 6 people and you mulled over each question, and then the conclusions were presented at the end. Okay, that's not important. I just wanted to make sure you knew that.
Thank you, Ed.
Do I have Alan and Chris and Claire in the queue? Alan?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I was on the Project Oversight Committee with Angela and Gary and Councilor Evans, Greg, and other folks that were on it. And we went through all of these thoroughly twice, actually, and went through and vetted all the options and asked a lot of detailed questions about them. So, and staff was on their game and could answer everything we wanted them to answer, and we worked through a lot of issues. I think the public outreach part of this has been very appropriate and at a good level. I think a lot of people responded to it. Of course, it's an interesting issue to a lot of folks. I think this is at a high level analysis. We've seen the maps, and they're kind of somewhat detailed with cross sections in the different colors about different ways of working through each corridor. But the next step is where the detailed analysis will come into play. And so moving all 4 of them forward was their unanimous recommendation of the Project Oversight Committee, and I supported that. And so I think that's an appropriate way to go at this point. What we're trying to do here is avoid the one route for every 9 years kind of time frame that we've been working on. And by moving all of these forward and working on them, we can crunch that time down to where it's much more appropriate. I think maybe staff can help out. What was around the country, other communities have seen time frames much, much shorter than ours. Maybe you can describe that a little bit.
We've heard from the Federal Transit Administration that there's communities that build light rail projects quicker than we build our bus rapid transit projects. That was a nice little push to figure out a process that might be more efficient.
Subtle.
That'll push.
So that's kind of what we're trying to avoid with moving all of them forward and then moving them. Also, you might want to talk about, we had a pretty big conversation, especially brought by Gary, about the belt line and why we weren't studying the belt line at the same time that we're studying the belt line for the fixes that are going to occur on that road, and maybe talk about belt line or MX in the belt line or next to. I think that's kind of interesting because hadn't really thought of whether or not Beltline or MX makes sense to be in that framework of the Beltline or next to it. Maybe next to it, actually cutting across traffic might actually be a better way to do it than putting it in the Beltline. But maybe you guys can talk about that a little bit more.
I think our answer is just what you said, is that we'll explore those alternatives as the Moving Ahead program advances. Once we determine which corridors are going to develop, then we'll know where the needs are to make connections between them and then determine what's the most appropriate way to do that. Is it with existing bus service across town, somewhere south, somewhere north, or is it on Beltline itself, which may or may not make sense, but we'll have to look at that more closely in the future.
Right. One of the things that was interesting about the Beltline is how you get off it is kind of complicated because it's got overpasses and it's not necessarily on these intersections. And maybe if it were next to it, which would entail building that extra little bridge next to the existing one that goes over the river, that might expedite MX a whole lot and make it a lot easier to use and better for people to use with much more accessibility on and off.
Chris is next, and then Claire.
Thank you. I really appreciate the level of work and detail you've gone into. I think it's good that you've studied it to this level, and I'm very impressed with the work you've done. And I think you have learned to be a lot more inclusive. The previous experience with MX has taught all of us a lot about how to be in that right balance between speed and inclusiveness, and I think we're much closer to that than we were before. And I think that can't do anything but help us. And when we look at what our solutions need to be, Coburg Road is a good example. It's not working the way it is during certain times of the day, and as was pointed out, it could take it a half an hour to get from Ferry Street to Costco. That's too long, and something needs to be done. And if it's just more cars or accommodating more cars, that may not necessarily be the right solution. I keep thinking of the old quote attributed to Henry Ford. If I had asked my customers what they wanted, they would have just said a faster horse. And so you have to kind of think beyond that element. That's important to have, but you also need to have vision, and I think the visionary element is what you're trying to achieve here. In no way, shape, or form is LTD or the City of Eugene trying to make people get rid of their cars. That's not the goal. And it's not trying to say you can't use your car, we want to somehow get rid of that as a form of transportation. But if there is an alternative, even for some trips, to say, you could use your car, but in this case there's a fast, easy, quick method that you can use to get from point A to point B, you might consider using it every once in a while. That's a desirable outcome. It reduces the load on the streets, it reduces cost, and there's a whole host of benefits, but it's not trying to get people to get rid of their cars. I think that's important to point out because sometimes we make it sound as if trying to pursue alternative transit is in an effort to try to get people to stop using their cars. And I won't stop using my car, I never will. But I might consider a certain number of trips on MX or some other form of transportation if it's easy and gets me to where I want to go in a timely fashion. I think that's really the solution that we're looking at here. So with that said, I do think we have to look at Coburg Road. And I do think we need to look at River Road and the streets you've outlined here. And that is going to be scary. And I get the fact that it's scary, but I think if we approach it very thoughtfully, very deliberately, and without sending the wrong signals, that this is to try to create solutions, not to create problems. I think that can be the path forward here. But I agree. I think we do need to look at these corridors simply because they're not working now the way they are.
Claire.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. And thank you for the presentation. Really appreciate it. My first question might sound a little bit like a criticism, but it's just more of a exploration. It does seem like the number of individuals, at least in terms of the numbers on the page, who've participated so far seems kind of small relative to the importance of the conversation, and I recognize we're just getting started, so obviously it takes time to ramp up that participation. But I wondered how you're tallying the number of people who've participated in the sounding board and the various other boards and commissions and neighborhood groups, and if there's a total in terms of everyone who's had an opportunity to weigh in some way besides the survey respondents and the 40 folks who came to the open house.
Not specifically.
We can get that for you, and I think it's a great idea because part of the purpose of the sounding board is to reach further to those networks. So if you say these sounding board members sent it to their boards, and there's a multiplier effect.
Exactly.
That I think we're not capturing in the survey responses.
Yeah, and I think it would behoove us all to capture that so we really know more clearly how many people are actually engaged in this and being giving us feedback on it. I think that'd be great.
Right. And those numbers don't represent the 20 different events we went to this summer and the people we talked to at those events.
Yeah. So, I know that's extra work, but I think it helps give credibility to the end result. And I do really, I know some of us said this at the first meeting we had on this, but now that we're seeing some of the tangible results of the work, I really want to appreciate this work and the way LTD has chosen to approach this planning process. As Councilor Zelenka pointed out, this multi-corridor look, gives us a much better chance of actually seeing some movement, no pun intended, on these improvements, and much faster than we would have seen if we'd used a different model. So that's very exciting. And I know this is preliminary data in the screening results, but it indicates right now if we were to build the MX, is the numbers I looked at along these corridors, we would get an estimated 19,300 people out of their cars, which means those cars wouldn't be on the road to cause congestion. And that's a significant number of people. And, in my mind, having a robust transit system such as is envisioned in this corridor study is part of having a modern, healthy, thriving community. So that's very exciting that we have potentially the opportunity to really start to get to that place. And then my last comment is a question about the cost estimates. I was curious, I know they're very, very high level, but I was curious why the River Road MX would be in the high bracket where another corridor which seems to, in my mind, present more complications, which would be the LCC corridor, had a lower estimate. And I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit to the cost estimates.
Sure. Based on the concepts we're looking at, especially River Road compared to LCC, there would be a lot more infrastructure per mile cost for the River Road corridor because the concepts we're looking at have a dedicated lane, primarily the whole length of the corridor, whereas the 30th to LCC does not. Specifically, it would be operating primarily in mixed traffic starting at Spring Boulevard.
Okay, thank you.
And I would think that corridors that are really built up are going to be much more expensive than corridors that aren't that built up because you just got a lot more things to move around.
Yeah.
And if I may just add one more comment, and those costs, just to make sure you caught that, include all of the other amenities along the corridor, such as the pedestrian, bicycle infrastructure needed, and the landscaping that would go into a project like this.
Ms. Pierce?
Thank you. I just had one comment. Since Julie Grossman is not here tonight, and I know she'd want to bring it up, Mr. Pryor had mentioned that it can get scary looking at some of these congested corridors. Gary had mentioned it can be exciting trying to cross where some of these corridors, and I know that it can get interesting. Julie has been working and reading about Vision Zero. And it might be helpful to start framing some of the conversation around these scary-looking corridors, the congested corridors, with the frame of, we don't want any more people to get hurt or die in these corridors. And it might be helpful to start weaving that into the conversation now as opposed to later.
I appreciate that. We're
Thank
actually
you.
going to be talking about Vision Zero this week at the City
Wednesday.
Council meeting. So
Wednesday.
it's very timely. Anybody else? Yes.
I might follow up on Councilor Surratt's comments about the people that participated. I was fortunate enough to be able to go to 4 of the first 5 get-togethers in the communities. And it was exciting to see the enthusiasm and the ideas that were there. And it was really very helpful for me to understand they have unique situations in each corridor. And it really opened, I think, the eyes of myself, but I think staff also saw some things that gave us an idea of how to look at those corridors maybe a little differently than we perceived originally. So I really agree that it would be nice to have a feel for what has the contact been in terms of the total number. I think it's probably quite a few more, as you point out. Thank you.
So I just wanted to make a comment, because we haven't tonight, that having a more complete transit system really has a lot to do with the economic development future of our area. And it's really key in terms of attracting business and young entrepreneurs and all kinds of folks to our area that can help strengthen our economy and build our tax base and all of that kind of thing. So I think we have to contextualize this in terms of what it does for us in many ways. Not just moving people from one place to another, but what it does to enhance all the things that we want to do. And I know that's what you're trying to, we talk about Envision Eugene, I know that's what you're doing, but I think we're going to have to continue to paint that picture for the community, that this is something where we're trying to move a whole lot of dials at the same time. And I'd also say that it seems to me that what happens normally, I would call it our lessons, it's our lessons learned, not necessarily LTD's, it's ours all the time, is that when you first broach a topic, there are people who engage at the front end. And they engage kind of vigorously. And there's a majority of us who don't engage at the front end and wait until it comes to our neighborhood. And then it's like a revelation. Something's going to happen here. And you get the reaction. So I don't know how you think out into the future about how you're going to go through this process. And I would even say just making a point of inviting new people into it in a very focused way. And one way to maybe think about inviting people in is, as you think about this, what are your concerns? What are your questions? What do you need? What can we answer for you? What do you need to know? Those kinds of things that really say it's safe and okay for you to ask these kinds of questions, because we're going to try to get you those answers. And maybe that kind of, every time we go through one of these things, I try to learn from it something that will make the next one easier to get through and less painful for everybody. Neighbors, community, planners, all of us. And so I'm just thinking as you move through this next phase, try to think how you invite people to really ask those questions that they need answered in kind of a vigorous way, and see if we can get them into the conversation a little earlier, especially those who as everybody does, sort of operate from a basis of fear about what you're going to be doing to the area, the community that they live in. So that's my thought about how to try to continue to improve what we do. Mike, you want to have something else to say?
I do, Mayor. Thank you. I want to echo your remarks, except for the very last one. I think there are a lot of people that do have concerns, and they do sometimes come up with worst outcomes as their first thought. I don't know if I'd call that fear, but I understood your intent. And I share that sentiment that I think most people would like to see us live in the kind of community that has a robust infrastructure that serves everyone well. I think we'd like to consider that in our community as a point of pride. I think maybe sometimes the process makes that hard for everybody to do, and that was the reason for my original questions about Coburg Road, is because I think that some of the challenges we've seen in our community over time and some of the conflicts may have occurred from lack of clarity around our group goals. And I would say, for example, I heard Chris say we absolutely do not want to force people out of our cars. And then from someone who approaches the world the way I do, and many of my neighbors and friends, I heard Claire say, but if we build this, we can get 19,000 people out of their cars. To me, that sounds like we do want to force people out of their cars. Now, that may not have been your intent, and I want to just be clear here. That may not be your intent, But what I want to make sure of is that we're having a conversation that everybody can participate in and hear without the conflict. I want to make sure that we are talking about this in a way where everybody is clear that is or isn't our intent. And I want to make sure that as we go along and study this, that what we're doing is trying to bring everybody along and to minimize conflict. And so I just, as someone who represents a lot of folks in that part of our community that would hear it that way, want to say, I think it's important how we talk about this. That's why I asked the questions I did about what was discussed. So thank you.
Mr. Norden?
Well, I had a question about the chart on the funding levels. It says the likelihood of obtaining federal capital for a lot of these projects is high, and yet it seems to me that there's a lot of work here, and there's going to be a lot of competition for any federal monies, and everybody in the country is going to be jumping on board to get stuff. And I wonder really how high this is in context of all the other projects we want. We're going to need more funding, I feel. I think the payroll tax has done a wonderful job for building LTD over these years, but to proceed with this whole project of moving ahead, I think we also have to engage or begin to suggest that new funding will be having to be accomplished from the community or from other states than relying on the federal government. But I'd like to hear a little comment about, Sasha or Chris.
That's an insightful comment. The way this was ranked was if the current concepts would meet the criteria to qualify for small starts, which is a grant program through the Federal Transit Administration. But you are correct, it is a very competitive environment, and I think we do see the writing on the wall that to be competitive for something like a small starts grant, we would probably need to look at a bigger match than we have in the past, which has traditionally been 20%. So that does mean probably more local or state funding to help make these competitive, or looking at other sources besides small starts.
I'd also make the point that when I think about this, and I think about rail, when we were at United Front trip, the thing that you heard on that, it depends on who's in charge in D.C., how this all shakes out. But in fact, right now, the message was, we're still in for the infrastructure, but we're not going to be running things. So you guys are going to have to come up with that yourselves, because we're not going to give you money for that. That's what I heard when we were there. So that on any kind of transportation, that becomes an increasing challenge for all of us, because all transportation needs some kind of supported help. So that's just a fact. So, and I did want to say that I don't find a contradiction between the two statements at all, because I think you can want good alternative transportation for all modes and at the same time provide an alternative so that some people can choose other modes that wouldn't choose them otherwise. And so in this case, you want a good system to hold all forms, including cars and transit. But if we're successful, some people are going to make a choice that says, hey, I just as soon get on the transit to go downtown as get in my car. So you can have both of those things at the same time. One is not trying to take away from the other. They both enhance the whole. I feel that every time I think about going to university from here, it's actually easier to hop on MX and to get to the university and get where you need to go than it is to get in your car, go down the road, try to find...
It absolutely is, man.
And so forth. So that's we're sort of aiming at what makes it easy for us all to get where we're going in a way that really enhances the livability for all of us at the same time. And I think I popped something here. There's Gary, and then there's George, and then there's Chris. Oh, and then you, Claire's first.
Mr. Gillespie?
Yeah, I think, Larry, you had the floor, I think.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so the 19,300 people I was referring to is LTD's estimate of ridership. So how that could be interpreted as forcing people to make a choice is very confusing to me. Offering people the opportunity to take transit instead of their cars doesn't require force or involve force of any kind. At the moment, without the option of timely, affordable transit, we are by default forcing people into their cars.
Now,
Mr. Gillespie?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of add to that. The ridership is already there.
Right.
And I remember a statistic that if you take one car away from a family, that family has approximately $9,800 of disposable income. Now, that's a lot of trips to Costco. That's a lot of trips to Pier 1 Imports. That's a lot of trips to over to Gateway Mall. So I guess I'm pushing back a little bit on. It would not hurt me to see fewer cars on the road. I could live with that.
I think I have George and Chris in the queue, is that correct? And are you in the queue too?
I'm not sure if I got my hand up to be seen. I would just like to put a little addendum on Councilor Clark's conversation that we need to. I think it's important. I think we have failed to inform the public of the importance of MX as a system. It's each leg. Everybody reacts to each leg, but as a system, now you could. I don't necessarily want to compare us to Portland, but compare us to the MAX. It is a system, and it will behoove economic development and personal freedom.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just like to say that I agree with what Mike heard, and I hear the same thing from the people that I represent. I think what the mayor did by explaining is what everybody should be doing ahead of this whole process.
That was my point.
Because what the mayor said is exactly the word that needs to get out. We're not trying to force people out of their cars. We're not trying to force people into their cars. We're trying to come up with a good system to give people the choice. If they don't want to ride the bus, they don't have to. If they don't want to drive the cars, they don't have to. As it is right now, for me, I have to walk over half a mile to get to the closest bus stop. So if there's some way to improve the system so more people use it, that's good. And I agree 100% with the way the mayor worded that. That was probably the best way to do it.
Chris?
I'm really impressed that we have gotten right to the heart of the issue. For me, the way when we talk about transportation, we can talk about corridors and buses and infrastructure, but unless we've resolved the discussion of the baseline issue, we're not going to get very far. As we've already discovered, we discovered it with MX. We've discovered it with a lot of other things. And the conversation we're having right now, from what I hear, is the core issue. That when we talk about transit as a form of transportation, we're talking about, in many cases, significant change. This will represent a change in the transportation structure. And to bring back up again what my youngest son once told me, he said, "Dad, I'm not afraid of change. I'm afraid of loss." And too often, change represents a loss. What am I going to lose when you come in and change something? Whether it's changing my TV lineup or changing the options at the grocery store. So many times when we change, I lose something. And so we need to approach the conversation about public transit as saying the intent of this is not to make you lose something like your car or lose your choices or something like that. The point of the discussion around transportation, and particularly alternative transportation, is to increase your options, to give you more choices, to enhance things and make it better. And we have not really had the conversation in that way. We come in and we talk about corridors and we talk about infrastructure and we talk about changes. And somewhere in there, people will leap to the conclusion that this is going to somehow represent a loss of my life. We heard that constantly in the MX conversation. That was the theme that went through, and you're going to build your MX, and I'm going to wind up lose my business, lose my street, lose my whatever. And it didn't have to be true. In 90% of the cases, it wasn't true. But we go into it assuming that change means loss because it's just happened too many times to us. So we need to do, as we've talked about here, we need to change the way we talk about transportation so that when we approach the technical side, people have already embraced the fact that they're going to get something, not lose something as a result of change. So that's why I mentioned the part about cars. You're not losing your car. You're gaining more choices for transportation. Use your car if you want to, but now you've got other choices as well. I think that's a net gain, and we've never really talked about it in those terms. So whatever corridor we choose, whatever system we build, we have to build it from that increasing rather than decreasing what the change represents for you.
Yeah, better than what I did.
Add to that is, and I heard Sasha bring it up, and I heard you bring it up, is some of the stuff that we get from this. When I think of the connections that are going to happen between, from neighborhoods to the transit corridor in West 11th, and the opportunity there may be in other places, the opportunity to make people's lives easier and better. When I think of Vision Zero and really trying to use this as an opportunity to make places safer for people to live, to be able to move around. So we have more than just in this discussion, more than how you get from here to here. We have, how do you make all of this that we live in work better for everybody? How do you make it safer, more pleasant, more usable, a better city for us all? And even though we end up in these sort of narrowed down discussions of that are the EIS discussions, but I think the real thing is the effort between what you do and what we do and others do together. How do we make a better city for everyone? And so it's so important for us to bring all the parts of us that are talking about so many different things all the time together to try to figure out how we can use this as an opportunity to really take a step forward for the people of our community.
I would like to follow up on the mayor's comments. One of the things that I heard a lot were the options. And the options, the word has come up more than once here, and that's exciting because there was an awful lot of people that were excited about how to get to the bus route. Now, in the areas of Santa Clara River Road, and even in North Eugene area, and in Bethel Datable, there's a lot of places there are not sidewalks. It is dangerous to get to the transportation corridor to where you could have the rapid transit. And that's why I love the comments of the options, because we're talking about the entire system, not just the stuff that's on rubber. We're talking about the bicycles, we're talking about the walkability and that type of thing, and the connection. And I got to admit, the 3 bridges that we're putting to facilitate on West 11th, that is really exciting because the connectivity is something that really needs to occur. So, great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody? Yes, Chris.
Mayor, thank you. I think there's an opportunity to reflect on the City of Eugene's triple bottom line approach to decision making, as well as environmental stewardship efforts at Lane Transit District, that we seek solutions that are equitable for people, the environment and our planet, and economic prosperity. And to touch back on one of your earlier comments, Mayor, you talked about the economic aspect. We've met several times and had a rather large meeting with the Eugene Chamber of Commerce's expanded local government affairs committee. And also, so they're very interested in what the economic opportunity is along the corridors, and they mentioned Highway 99 as having a lot of potential. We also have partners in our community conversation through Better Eugene Springfield Transit that we've been meeting with them periodically throughout the moving ahead process, and they are working feverishly to keep that conversation going and look for best outcomes as well.
I would point out just last week we had a conversation that was led by Councilor Evans around economic development planning for the Bethel area. This is an essential part of that conversation. And we often hear from folks in Bethel about how they wish there were more mixed-use areas that with more to offer for people in the community. Well, I think we should be looking at that as we look at this too. I think it can help move those things along for that part of our community as well. So the opportunities are big if we keep our eyes on it.
Yes, Mr. Kilcoyne?
Yes. I think this has been a really good discussion that we've had tonight, and the comment was made a few times during the conversation that this is part of a bigger vision for transit that would support Envision Eugene, the goals of Envision Eugene, and also support the efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And and I just, I think that the partnership that we've had with the City of Eugene over this project has been really good, and I'm, looking forward to, seeing it continue. I think a lot of good things will come out of this.
Well, that probably leads me to the end of this conversation we're going to be having together. But before that, I don't know that I'll be sitting around the table with Mr. Kilcoyne again in the near future. And so on behalf of all of us at the city, we want to really thank you for your service. And we're really proud of having LTD being chosen as one of the best transit systems in the nation. We applaud you all for that work, and we really benefit as a city from the contribution you have made and that the LTD has made for us. So just wanted to say that and to give you a big thank you as part of our city council meeting. Okay, I think that's it, guys.
Okay.
Unless you got more.
Nope. Anybody else?
Okay. Thank you. We have about a half hour left, but you're welcome to go now.
The LTD board is adjourned.
In the middle.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you in a couple of weeks, probably, right?
Yeah, that's right. MX steering committee, yeah. I think everybody else on the board is going to be in San Francisco.
While we're letting them go out,
Committees.
everybody's thinking about
Committee reports.
I got you, I didn't respond back. Yeah, no, I'm
good. Well, is there anything that...
Very nice to meet you.
Yeah, and I forgot the most important.
Yes, we should have it. No, I know. My world is crazy.
Okay, I'm going to be continuing our meeting, everybody.
We're the only non-voting.
So, counselors, I'm going to go around the table about committee reports and items of interest, and if we have time, we can also do the
Consent agenda?
consent agenda.
Yay.
All right, thank you, everybody. Bye. So, who wants to start? Start with
No, this is actually the time of month between having reported on all my meetings and the start of the next meetings. But I do have one question. We received an email, and I don't know who to address this to, about a person complaining about the smell of marijuana coming into their property from their neighboring property, and it's causing the person that sent the email evidently health problems, and it's just a nuisance. Has there been any discussion about an ordinance about that, or is that already covered by an ordinance or something that we can respond back to this individual and tell them?
I do remember this being looked at by our Building and Permit Services Department, so I think that probably the best source, and I don't have that information off the top of my head right now, but I think the best approach would be for our BPS, our code enforcement type folks, to be the one that takes a look at this in response to the individual. If that would be helpful.
Okay. And then, Kurt, since you're at the table, the added ADA passageways around the speed tables, or whatever they're called, I can't remember. They've been renamed so many times in Arcadia. It looks like they've completed all of them, and I think they're working. They're great for people walking. I have seen some tire tracks, though, on the dirt edge of the the ADA pathway. So I'm not certain if it's people parking next to them or if it's people trying to avoid the speed table altogether and going and using those instead. So I don't know how those are going to hold up if that be the case under vehicle traffic, because I know they weren't built for vehicles. But other than that, the speed tables or whatever they're called seem to be working. I have a pickup truck, and if I do 20 miles an hour and the speed limit through there is 25, I don't have to slow down a bit. I think they're working great.
Eddie, you have anything?
Yes, thank you. Well, the Al-Rapa board meets next week. I don't have anything from them right now, but the calls I've been getting are about nuisances and rats. Apparently there are a lot of rats in my part of town lately. Are they sending them out there? I don't know whether we can do anything about that or not, but nuisance also, the abandoned houses where people apparently maybe there's been a foreclosure. Anyway, the people are missing and the house is falling down. Tree branches are falling. There's tall grass. And people are afraid that, I think that makes a good place for rats too, but it's been especially scary because of the dry season. People have been afraid of fire danger from dried out wood, and some of these abandoned houses have wood piles beside them. And I don't know if we have sufficient laws. I'm going to request a work session about nuisance abatement. I just came back from the League of Oregon Cities meeting in Bend, Oregon, which has a beautiful downtown, by the way. And one of the most interesting sessions I went to was about nuisance control. And the cities of Salem, the Dalles, and Brownsville, all in different ways, seem to have some pretty strong ordinances that permit them to do something about nuisances. And I hope that we can look into that too. I think there's a new state law that requires banks makes it possible, I'm not sure who reports it, makes it possible to know when there's been a foreclosure, for example. So I think that's a matter of safety, health, and happiness for people. I went to a session too on SDCs. Well, actually it was on housing. But something that Bend is doing is, and I don't know whether we've done anything like this or not, but if a builder gets more units per acre, there can be a reduction in SDCs. Not the parks SDCs, because they have a separate park department there. But other SDCs might be reduced, which is an incentive then to do more intense development. And they are having the same problems we have, though, as far as expanding and things like that. I wanted to ask about cell towers. We still haven't, as far as I know, we still haven't heard what we can do about cell towers. And I guess I do want to say that am I out of time?
Yeah.
Okay. I help do another time.
Get in another round if you want.
Give me another round then.
Mike?
Yeah, I'd like to combine the two things I just heard with the two of you, because I think it's really interesting, nuisance ordinances. I apologize, I didn't understand your answer to George's question very well, but can I surmise that essentially isn't offensive odors in your neighborhood, isn't that a nuisance ordinance issue?
Well, I mean, we'd have to take a look at the code and see whether it actually falls within the definition of what is defined as a nuisance to have it trigger the nuisance abatement process. And I don't have that answer for you. I'm happy to get it for you. I know that there had been some discussions around, and I don't know if it was marijuana, but cigarette smell as well when it comes to wafting amongst neighborhoods. And so I don't want to misinform by talking about it tonight, but we can get you that information.
We actually had this was a while ago. It was a couple of years ago. We had several discussions at this table about nuisance ordinance with regard to backyard farming. And as I recall, one of the issues around keeping chickens and small animals was around smell as a nuisance issue. And I remember the specifics of that discussion, actually. And so I was going to say when it came around to me that I think that's maybe an appropriate way to deal with the issue, because I saw that email too. I also think that that might, on an expanded level, in how we consider it, be an answer to some other issues that are before us these days, in how we deal with it in less of a police department enforcement by force than we do as a nuisance issue. There may be other things we could look at in that regard. That's all.
Yeah, on that topic, if you recall when we were talking about the on-site property management, which we just decided not to do, but one of the things that the staff came up with when they did that research was nuisance ordinances from around the country that deal with things that bug neighbors in particular and that are enforceable. And they came up with a whole bunch of different examples of what other cities have done. And as part of that last work session that we did, I asked when they bring that back, that they bring back those examples, because they do fit a lot of the things that we're talking about. It wasn't just particular to that issue, but around neighborhood things that can be put into ordinances. They don't have to all be cookie cutter per neighbor or areas either, but they what other folks have done was really interesting to read when I was informed about that stuff.
Maybe the downtown neighborhood.
Yeah, maybe there might be a nuisance there. I was at the Fairmont neighborhood meeting the other day, and one of the things that they did at that meeting was to actually have an engineer firm come and talk about earthquake and house safety, and a lot of the resources, and Marnie had talked about from Risk Services about our website, and there's a lot of stuff under risk management on our website about that. But the big takeaway for me was getting an engineer to come out and look at your house. It's about a month out right now. If you're trying to get earthquake insurance or some other kinds of insurance, sometimes they require an engineer to look at your house, and the big one being that you need to have your house bolted from the foundation to the house. And that is the big thing, that people's houses slide off their foundation and that destroys the house. So that was a big takeaway for me, other than you have to wait a long time to get an engineer to be able to come to your house to look at that stuff, unless you already are an engineer.
Chris?
For me, probably the principal thing to report on is the Lane Council of Governments had their meeting last week. And probably the single most important thing to talk with you about is, as you recall, 2 or 3 years ago when we were struggling with our support on LCOG, part of that was built around the fact that they had enormous debt, were losing money, and looked like their long-term prospects were not financially viable. And since Brenda Wilson has been the executive director there, she has completely turned around the organization, and our financial report that we received last week shows that LCOG is not only in the black and functioning well, but its long-term prospects are great. And so I couldn't report to you any more strongly how pleased I am with where LCOG is right now compared to where it was 3 years ago. It's doing good work. It's relevant to not only our needs, but to the needs of the other communities in Lane County. They're providing good services, and they're constantly evaluating what they do and how they can do it better. So Brenda's done just a great job. So I'm incredibly pleased with the progress they've made.
Good to hear.
Greg?
I think last week we heard the report of the Human Rights Commission, and I think that pretty much summarizes what my report would be in terms of that committee. And the Human Services Commission, from my perspective, I think probably if Claire wants to chime in, there wasn't any earth-shattering things that came out of that meeting that we attended last week either. So that's my report.
So a couple things is I wanted to tell you when I read that email about the odor, I did ask our staff to follow up on that. So Reagan was going to be in touch with you about that issue.
Good.
Anyway.
Good.
wanted to say the U of O community welcome is tomorrow evening, where we all go out and do the meet and greets, and it's kind of that combination of glad you're here, welcome, welcome, be good. Then last Friday was the stand down where we had vets at the fairgrounds getting all their needs met and making connections. Gave a report on Operation 365 of housing all our homeless vets in 2015, and we are now up to about 270 plus housed, so that's a good thing.
Excellent.
Chris and Claire and I and 4 of our staff met to start the discussion about how we can share our downtown public spaces better. And staff are coming back to us with a plan based on that discussion, and so we'll keep you up on that. There seems to be I think there's a chamber committee that's going to be offering suggestions. I think there's a tech committee that's going to be offering suggestions. I think there's a lot of information that's going to be coming our way. And then Saturday, I believe, is the Great Willamette cleanup.
Yes.
Yes. And so anybody who wants to join in the river cleanup is welcome to come and be part of that. I intend to go out and participate. And then now I have a second round, Claire, and then George, and then Betty.
So I just wanted to thank Councilor Polling for mentioning that email that we got from, because I believe that person's in my ward, and I had no idea how to respond. So I was going to respond and say, I'm not sure what we can do. Let's see what we can find out.
Knocked on those doors.
Yeah, yeah, that's true too. So I appreciate also, Mayor, having your staff connect that person with some kind of answer, because I'm sure this is not the only person in our community having this experience, and we should have some kind of response. And as I recall, the state legislation did not address this issue at all. So we are going to need to figure out some kind of community way. I like the thinking that Councilor Clark mentioned of, a nuisance rather than law enforcement piece. So.
Yeah.
Councilor Polling.
Thank you. I really didn't mean to be a nuisance and start this conversation. Anyway.
Sure.
Some time ago, I received an email, and it was kind of a chain between an individual in my ward and the compliance officer about their neighbor feeding crows. And long story short, the situation got resolved one way or the other. And as a result of that, I had a conversation with the city manager about looking into an ordinance about feeding nuisance critters.
Yeah.
The only problem with that was how do you define a nuisance critter? And if you don't feed crows, does that mean you don't feed the songbirds? And people like songbirds, but not crows, et cetera. Another problem is with the herd of turkeys that we have infested. They're all over the place.
Everywhere.
Multiple.
Now,
Thanksgiving's coming up.
Understanding that, all these are dealt with by the compliance officer, and we're understaffed there, and it's all complaint driven. But, maybe it's time we had a work session to have a big discussion about how these nuisance ordinance happen, how they are enforced, and maybe open up the discussion to, in reference to turkeys, I don't remember what city it was here in Oregon, but they have passed an ordinance that now allows live trapping of wild turkeys within the city limits, which was illegal before. And we could throw in the nutria.
I was
that also. We throw in as many nutria as we can.
And nutria.
No problem. We need to do.
So if that's a conversation, and I asked John about the work session, and at the point that we are with Envision Eugene and everything else going on, I didn't want to put that out just yet because we have enough on our table right now.
Right.
But I just want to make people aware that I don't want it to get too far down the line and get off the radar, but I think that's something that we need to bring back to the table and have a discussion about.
Agree.
Happy to talk about how to get rid of turkeys anytime.
Here. We have a lead to do it.
As long as it's not with oyster stuffing.
Betty.
Well, as I just said, I was going to ask for a work session on nuisance, and I think we should do that. As far as odors are concerned, there are lots of other odors besides marijuana. That was discussed. The three best sessions I went to in League of Oregon Cities were one on marijuana, one on nuisances, and one on housing. And there's some overlap there. But people did talk about odors as nuisances, but there are lots of kinds of odors, and there are lots of kinds of things that neighbors do that aren't pleasant.
That's not an odor, that's perfume.
Perfume is one of the things that people are upset about sometimes. But I did want to say that I think that this last conference, League of Oregon Cities, was one of the best I've been to. I do think would be good if more people from our council went to those meetings. It was very informative. It's very good to meet people from other cities too. There were two from Springfield there this time. Terry McDonald was one of the speakers at a gathering, and there were lots of compliments about him. People, after hearing him, other people thought that we had solved the homeless problem in Eugene. And I said, well, not quite, but he was very impressive. Glenn Klein was at a session too. I didn't go to one where he spoke, but it was, I think that not only do we get things out of those things, but we contribute something by being there. Thank you.
Alan?
Yeah, that reminded me of one of the other things that I did recently, which was I attended, I think Claire and the mayor were there too. It was a fundraiser for Emerald Village, which is Dan Bryant and Terry McDonald, a whole bunch of other people getting together to move forward with the model of the Opportunity Village. And it's Emerald Village, or Square One is the one where they've got the model, and they're moving forward. And there was a fundraiser, and and it was at Sweet Cheeks Winery, and that evening they raised $110,000 to promote to build these. And they've also got I think it was 6, maybe 8 architects that have designed micro housing and got poster boards of the different types of housing.
16?
Oh yeah, okay, 16. And I only saw about 8 of them there, but and the design of the houses that people can live in that are small, and trying to get into the $25,000 range to build one of these micro housings, and it was very encouraging to see that many people out supporting that and that much money raised to move this along. So we'll be hearing more about it. It also spurred me to think that, well, if they've got that much money, then they're going to need places for this. So I think one of the things that we need to do is think about how we want to allow these things to occur within the city. They're not always compatible with our zoning and different ordinances that we have, especially with, say, for instance, in residential areas, 14 people per acre is the limit, and a village like that would be more than that. So there's some things that we need to think about. And also I also was thinking about the household dispersal policy that we have for affordable housing, where they're spread around the city as opposed to all congregating in Claire's ward as they are now. And so I think those are things that we're going to need to grapple with and should grapple with in the near future.
We're going to do the consent calendar real quickly, and I would just say that I read that Ashland is calling a city summit on nuisance deer, just so you know.
Yeah, deer's another one.
Yeah. So I move to approve the items on the consent agenda.
Second.
Moved and seconded.
Did everybody get a deer nuisance letter from Ashland then?
Bad deer.
Out of order, Counselor. Anybody got anything? Yes, Betty?
Just the tentative agenda, I wanted to say one thing about, which is I'm still hoping for something about cell tower location before it's an emergency again.
Got it. Okay, ready to vote on it? All those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and none in opposition. It passes. Thank you. We'll be back in 7:30.